Picture this. A rusty Vega pulls into the staging lanes and everyone starts laughing. The paint's faded, the body's rotting, and it sounds like a lawnmower. But 11 seconds later, those Camaro drivers aren't laughing anymore. This is the story of how a 17-year-old kid with $55 just rewrote the rules of drag racing. Indiana, 1976. The drag strips were dominated by one thing: big block V8s. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you needed a Camaro, a Firebird, maybe a Mustang if you were brave, and you needed cubic inches, lots of them. The bigger the engine, the faster the car. That's what everyone believed. Mark Donahue Jr. was about to prove them all wrong. Donahue wasn't like the other kids at his high school. While they were flipping through Hot Rod magazine, dreaming about 454 big blocks and Holley carburetors, he was studying physics, power-to-weight ratios specifically. He'd calculated something interesting. A 2,200-pound car with 200 horsepower would accelerate exactly like a 3,500-pound Camaro with 350 horsepower. The math was simple. The implications were huge. Everyone else was chasing horsepower. Donahue realized he should be chasing weight reduction. The problem was money. Donahue had almost none. His dad worked at a factory. His mom was a teacher. There was no trust fund waiting to buy him a nice Camaro. If he wanted to go racing, he'd have to do it on a budget that would make most people laugh. So he started looking at cars nobody else wanted, cars people threw away. And that's when he found the Vega. The Chevrolet Vega was General Motors' big mistake. Launched in 1971 to compete with Japanese imports, it featured an innovative aluminum engine that promptly became famous for all the wrong reasons. The engines overheated, the heads warped, they burned oil faster than they burned gasoline. By 1976, Vegas had a reputation as disposable cars. You drove them until they died, which usually took about 2 years, then you junked them. Nobody wanted to own one, nobody wanted to fix one, and absolutely nobody thought you could race one.
Donahue found his at a salvage yard outside Indianapolis. It was sitting between a wrecked Impala and what used to be a Pinto. The body was rough. Rust had eaten through the quarter panels. The interior looked like rats had been living in it. The original aluminum engine was seized completely solid. The junkyard owner looked at this skinny teenager staring at the worst car on the lot and made an offer. $25 and you can tow it out of here today. Donahue handed over the cash. He borrowed his dad's truck and dragged that Vega home. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. His friends couldn't understand why he didn't just save up for a real car. Even his father asked if he was sure about this. But Donahue had done the math. The Vega weighed 2,200 pounds. That was 1,300 pounds lighter than a Camaro. If he could find 200 horsepower somewhere, anywhere, he could beat cars that cost 50 times more. The aluminum Vega engine was garbage, but Donahue had a plan. Chevy had used a different four-cylinder in earlier cars, the Chevy II four-cylinder that came in 1960s Novus. These engines were bulletproof. Cast iron block, proven reliability, and they loved to rev. More importantly, they were everywhere in junkyards because GM had built millions of them. Donahue went back to the salvage yard. $15 bought him a complete Chevy II four-cylinder from a wrecked 1964 Nova. Now he had $40 invested and 2 pieces of junk sitting in his parents' garage. This is where most people would have given up, but Donahue spent the next 2 weeks rebuilding that four-cylinder engine with nothing but hand tools and a Chilton's manual. He bought a rebuild kit at the local parts store, $15 for rings, bearings, and gaskets. He cleaned every component, he measured clearances, he torqued everything to specification. When he was done, he had a mechanically sound engine that cost him a total of $30. The performance modifications came next, and this is where Donahue's physics background started to show. He couldn't afford performance parts. No high-compression pistons, no aftermarket camshaft, no fancy carburetor, so he made the stock parts work harder. He ported the cylinder head himself, using his father's Dremel tool, carefully grinding away material to smooth the airflow. He advanced the ignition timing until the engine pinged under load, then backed it off just enough. He removed every unnecessary component. Power steering bracket, gone. Air conditioning compressor, gone. Alternator, gone. Everything that added weight or created parasitic drag had to go. The carburetor got attention too. The stock Rochester single barrel was designed for fuel economy, not power. Donahue enlarged the venturi opening with a drill bit and some sandpaper. He changed the jets to allow more fuel flow. He modified the accelerator pump to deliver a stronger shot during acceleration. Total cost was maybe $5 in hardware store supplies. The result was a carburetor that could support 140 horsepower while still working reliably. But the real genius of Donahue's build wasn't the engine, it was the transmission and gearing. Everyone else was obsessed with peak horsepower numbers. How much power could you make at the top of the RPM range? Donahue understood something more important. Drag races are won in the first 60 feet. Get a good launch and you can hold off a more powerful car all the way to the finish line. The Vega's 4-speed manual had incredibly aggressive gear ratios that nobody had noticed. First gear was 3.11 to 1. Combined with the Vega's 3.73 rear axle ratio, that created a final drive ratio of 11.6 to 1 in first gear. What does that mean in practical terms? Torque multiplication. The 4-cylinder only made 115 pound-feet of torque at the crankshaft. Nothing impressive. But multiply that by 11.6 and suddenly you're putting 420 pound-feet to the rear wheels in first gear. The Camaros had more engine torque, sure, but they had taller gearing designed for highway cruising. Their torque multiplication was actually lower where it mattered most, right off the line. Donahue understood another principle that most street racers ignored: rotating mass. Every component that spins in a drivetrain has to be accelerated. The heavier those components, the slower the acceleration. His 4-cylinder had a lightweight flywheel, a small clutch, and a tiny drive shaft. The pistons, connecting rods, and crankshaft were all significantly lighter than V8 components. Less rotating mass meant the engine could change RPM faster. It's the same reason sport bikes are so quick off the line. It's not just power to weight of the vehicle, it's power to weight of every spinning component. The suspension setup showed more clever thinking. Vegas came with simple coil springs in the front and leaf springs in the rear. Nothing sophisticated, but they had one advantage. They were designed for a light car. The spring rates were soft, perfect for weight transfer during launch. Donahue lowered the rear slightly by removing one leaf from each spring pack. This created a better launch angle and helped plant the rear tires. He was running cheap street tires because he couldn't afford slicks, but the light weight meant he could get decent traction with just 195mm wide rubber. By late spring of 1976, the Vega was ready. Total investment was $55, $25 for the car, $15 for the engine, $15 for the rebuild kit. Donahue had built what everyone said was impossible, a competitive drag car for less than the cost of a good date. The first time Donahue brought his Vega to US 31 Dragway, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect: laughter. It was a Thursday night test and tune session. The staging lanes were packed with the usual crowd: built Camaros with cowl induction hoods, Firebirds with Trans Am stripes, a few Mustangs with Shelby clones, and one gorgeous Plymouth Barracuda with a 440 six-pack that sounded like controlled violence. Then there was Donahue's Vega, looking like it had been rescued from a scrapyard that morning, because it had been, a few weeks earlier. The other racers couldn't help themselves. They walked over to look. They made jokes. One guy asked if Donahue was lost, said the car show was next weekend. Another asked if he needed a tow truck on standby. Even the track officials seemed concerned. They asked if the car was safe to run. Donahue popped the hood and let them inspect. Everything was secure. The engine was bolted in properly, the drive shaft had fresh U-joints, the wheels were tight. The officials shrugged and sent him to the staging lanes. Donahue's first race was against a 1969 Camaro SS. The owner had just spent 20 minutes bragging about his build. Bored 350 cubic inches out to 383, forged pistons, a Holley 750 double pumper, headers that cost more than Donahue's entire car. The guy had probably $3,000 under that hood, easy. He looked at Donahue's Vega and smirked. This was going to be fun. Free win to boost his confidence before the real racing started. They pulled into the staging lanes. The Camaro's V8 was lumping along with that distinctive high-performance camshaft idle. Deep, rhythmic, intimidating. Donahue's 4-cylinder was spinning at 2,500 RPM, held against the clutch, ready to launch. The sound was completely different. High-pitched, buzzy, like an angry hornet instead of a grumpy bear. The contrast made people laugh even harder. The Christmas tree started its countdown. Amber, 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 green. Donahue sidestepped the clutch and the Vega launched like it had been shot from a cannon. The lightweight front end lifted slightly, the rear tires bit into the asphalt, and that little four-cylinder screamed to 8,000 RPM before Donahue grabbed second gear. By the time the Camaro driver realized what was happening, Donahue was already 2 car lengths ahead. The four-cylinder was spinning 7,500 RPM in third gear when Donahue crossed the 8-mile marker. The Camaro was gaining now, using its superior horsepower to close the gap, but it was too late. Donahue crossed the quarter-mile finish line in 11.89 seconds at 98 miles per hour. The Camaro ran 12.3 at 108. The Camaro had a higher trap speed, meaning more horsepower, but Donahue had won by 0.4 of a second. In drag racing, that's an eternity.
The Camaro driver couldn't believe it. He demanded to see under Donahue's hood. There had to be nitrous, maybe a turbo hidden somewhere. Donahue popped the hood and showed him. Stock Chevy II 4-cylinder, single-barrel carburetor, factory exhaust manifolds. No power adders, no tricks, just physics and smart engineering. The Camaro driver walked away shaking his head. $3,000 in engine parts, beaten by a junkyard special that cost less than a tank of race gas. Word spread fast through the Indiana drag racing community. By the next weekend, people had heard about the kid with the Vega. Some thought it was a fluke. Maybe the Camaro driver missed a shift. Maybe something was wrong with his car. But Donahue kept showing up. US 31 Dragway, Muncie Dragway, Bunker Hill, every track within driving distance. And every time, the same thing happened. That rusty Vega would leave V8 muscle cars in the dust. The technical reality of what Donahue achieved was remarkable when you broke down the numbers. His rebuilt Chevy II 4-cylinder was producing about 140 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. Not impressive on paper until you calculated power-to-weight ratio. In a 2,200-pound car, that worked out to 15.7 pounds per horsepower. A typical street-driven Camaro with a healthy 350 making 300 horsepower weighed 3,500 pounds. That's 11.6 pounds per horsepower. Better, but not by as much as you'd think. And that's assuming the Camaro was actually making its advertised power, which most weren't after years of wear and questionable tuning. But raw horsepower was only part of the equation. The gearing made all the difference. Donahue's aggressive first gear meant he was making 420 pound-feet of torque at the rear wheels from a standing start. The Camaros might have 350 pound-feet at the engine, but their taller first gear meant they were only putting 280 or so to the wheels. Donahue had a mechanical advantage that overcame his horsepower deficit where it mattered most. The other factor was acceleration efficiency. Donahue's lightweight rotating assembly meant the engine could change RPM almost instantaneously. When he shifted gears, the engine could match the new speed in milliseconds. The heavy V8 internals took longer to accelerate, which meant slower shifts and wasted time. Over a quarter-mile pass with 3 gear changes, those milliseconds added up to car lengths. Even the aerodynamics worked in Donahue's favor, though he probably didn't realize it at the time. The Vega had a smaller frontal area than a Camaro, less wind resistance. At 100 miles per hour, that might save you 1/10 of a second. Not much, but in close races, every advantage counted. By the fall of 1976, Donahue had become a legend in Indiana street racing circles. He'd race anywhere, anytime. Industrial park roads after midnight, abandoned airport runways, even the occasional stoplight-to-stoplight run, though he tried to avoid those for obvious legal reasons. His reputation grew with each victory. The kid with the $55 Vega who could beat anything. The Camaro owners were particularly frustrated. Here was Chevrolet's economy car, the bottom of the product line, embarrassing Chevrolet's performance car. Some accused Donahue of cheating. There had to be something hidden, maybe a nitrous system with really good plumbing, maybe a different engine entirely. One guy even claimed Donahue had stuffed a rotary engine in there, which would have cost 10 times what the entire car was worth and made no sense whatsoever. To prove his legitimacy, Donahue started popping the hood after every race. Let them look. Let them see the stone-stock Chevy II 4-cylinder with its single-barrel carburetor and factory exhaust manifolds.
No nitrous bottles, no hidden turbos, no secret weapons. Just basic physics and smart engineering applied to a platform everyone else had written off. The more they looked, the more confused they became. How was this possible? The local Chevrolet dealers were having their own crisis. They'd been trained to push customers from Vegas to Camaros. More profit margin, higher commission. The Vega was supposed to be for people who couldn't afford anything better. Now they had customers coming in asking about Vegas for drag racing. Could they special order one without air conditioning? What gear ratios were available? How much weight could they remove from the factory? The dealers didn't know how to respond. Their entire sales strategy was built on the assumption that Vegas were slow, boring economy cars. Donahue had just destroyed that assumption. Some dealers tried to discredit him. They told customers the story was exaggerated, that Donahue must have spent thousands on hidden modifications, that you couldn't really beat a V8 with a four-cylinder. But the evidence kept mounting. More people saw him race. More people lost to him. The truth was undeniable. A properly built Vega could embarrass cars that cost 10 times more. What Donahue had started was bigger than just winning races. He'd challenged the entire philosophy of American performance cars. The muscle car era was dying in 1976. Insurance companies had made big blocks unaffordable for young drivers. Emissions regulations were strangling horsepower. The 454 cubic inch monsters of the late 60s were giving way to smog-choked small blocks that made less power than their predecessors. Everyone was mourning the death of performance. The golden age was over, or so they thought. Donahue proved that performance hadn't died. It had just evolved. You didn't need 454 cubic inches anymore. You needed to think about the complete package: weight distribution, gearing strategy, aerodynamics, rotating mass. All the variables working together. The same principles that Colin Chapman had used to dominate Formula One with his lightweight Lotus cars could apply to drag racing. Add lightness, Chapman famously said. Donahue had taken that philosophy and applied it to a Chevrolet economy car that cost $25.
The Chevrolet engineers who designed the Vega probably never imagined it as a performance platform. They were trying to compete with Datsun and Toyota on fuel economy and price point. Build it cheap, sell it cheap, move volume. But they'd accidentally created something special. That lightweight unibody construction meant for cost savings turned out to be perfect for racing. The compact dimensions reduced frontal area and improved weight transfer. Even the maligned aluminum engine proved a concept that reducing weight was more important than adding displacement. Other racers started paying attention. If a four-cylinder Vega could run 11s, what could you do with a small block V8? The Vega's engine bay was tight, but creative people found ways. By 1977, the Vega Pro Street movement was taking shape. Builders were installing 350 cubic inch small blocks, then 383 strokers, eventually big blocks, creating genuine 8-second cars that weighed nothing and went like missiles. But everyone in that movement acknowledged where it started, with a teenager who proved you didn't need a V8 to go fast. Donahue's specific build became a blueprint for budget racers everywhere. The Chevy II four-cylinder swap made perfect sense. These engines were superior to the Vega's original aluminum unit in every way that mattered for racing. They could handle 8,000 RPM all day without grenading. The cast iron bottom end could take the abuse of hard launches and money shifts. Parts were everywhere because GM had built them for decades across multiple platforms. You could find one in any junkyard for pocket change. The carburetor modifications showed real ingenuity. Donahue had turned a fuel economy carburetor into a performance piece for basically free. He understood that airflow restriction was limiting power, so he opened up the Venturi. He knew the stock jetting was too lean for performance, so he richened the mixture. He recognized that throttle response mattered for drag racing, so he modified the accelerator pump. These weren't random changes. Each modification addressed a specific limitation. That kind of thoughtful approach separated successful builds from expensive failures. The exhaust system deserved recognition too. Donahue couldn't afford headers, those tubular steel manifolds that every performance engine was supposed to have. Instead, he took the factory cast iron manifolds and made them work.
He ground out the passages to reduce restriction. He matched the ports to the cylinder head to eliminate turbulence. He wrapped them in header tape to retain exhaust heat and improve scavenging. Then he cobbled together an exhaust system from junkyard parts. A Pinto muffler here, some Chevette pipe there. It wasn't pretty, but it flowed well enough to support 140 horsepower. Sometimes good enough is good enough.
Even the cooling system showed Donahue's understanding of his specific use case. The Vega's aluminum engine was notorious for overheating in daily driving, but the iron Chevy II four-cylinder ran much cooler. Donahue realized that in the 11 seconds it took to run the quarter mile, the engine never got hot enough to matter, so he removed the fan entirely. Less parasitic drag meant more power to the wheels. Was it a car you could drive on the street for hours? No, but Donahue wasn't building a street car. He was building a drag car that could be driven to the track. This kind of purpose-driven engineering was rare in the 70s street racing scene. Most people built cars that tried to do everything: fast on the drag strip, comfortable on the street, reliable for daily driving. They compromised on everything and excelled nothing. Donahue built a car with one purpose: go fast in a straight line for 11 seconds. Every decision supported that goal. Every component was optimized for that specific task. The result was a machine that dominated its competition despite overwhelming disadvantages on paper. The impact on drag racing culture was profound. Before Donahue's Vega, people thought they understood the formula for speed: big engine, good transmission, sticky tires. Simple. After Donahue, everyone had to reconsider. Maybe the formula was wrong. Maybe displacement wasn't destiny. Maybe cubic inches were just one variable among many and not even the most important one. Kids started looking at cars differently. That beat-up Pinto in the junkyard? Maybe it had potential. That Chevette with a blown engine? Maybe it could be a diamond in the rough. Weight became the enemy, and everyone started calculating power-to-weight ratios before making modifications. The Camaro guys eventually figured out how to beat Donahue, of course. They started showing up with stripped interiors, aluminum cylinder heads, and steep gear ratios of their own. But by then, the damage was done. The myth of V8 supremacy had been shattered. Donahue himself moved on from the Vega eventually. He sold it for $500 to another young racer who wanted to continue the legacy, 10 times what he'd paid for the entire build. He used that money to start building a tube-frame dragster that would eventually run in the sevens. But he never forgot the lessons learned from that $55 Vega. Weight matters more than displacement. Gearing can multiply torque better than cubic inches. A smart build beats an expensive one every time. And most importantly, never underestimate the underdog. Those lessons spread throughout the drag racing community. They influence how people thought about building cars for decades. The Vega Pro Street movement of the late 70s and early 80s took these principles to their logical extreme. Builders created Vegas that ran in the sixes with turbocharged four-cylinders or small displacement V8s. The same platform that GM considered a commercial failure became one of the most successful drag racing platforms of its era, all because one teenager saw potential where others saw junk. Today, a clean Vega shell can sell for thousands of dollars to drag racers. They're still popular in bracket racing and nostalgia drag events. The same cars that dealers couldn't give away in the late 70s are now coveted for their lightweight and modification potential. It's a complete reversal of their original market position. The secretary's car became the racer's dream. The disposable Econobox became a collector's item. History is strange that way. The technical legacy of Donahue's build lives on in modern drag racing too. Today's import drag scene is built on exactly the same principles: lightweight chassis, high-revving four-cylinders, optimal gearing. The Honda Civics and Mitsubishi Evolutions running 9-second passes are spiritual successors to that $55 Vega. They prove that displacement is just one path to speed, not the only path. Modern manufacturers have learned this lesson as well. The current trend toward turbocharged four-cylinder engines in performance cars validates everything Donahue proved in 1976.